welcome everybody to the 19th IRS International Lecture on Society and Space. And we are very happy to have our main speaker for tonight, Alessandra Faggian. She's a professor of applied economics, director of social sciences, and deputy director of the Gran Sasso Science Institute in L'Aquila, Italy. She is also vice president of the Italian Economics Association. In 2015, Alessandra was recipient of the Geoffrey Ewings Award by the North American Regional Council for outstanding research contributions by a young scholar in the field of regional science. In 2020, she got the European Regional Science Association Award as the best European regional scientist. And in 2021, she got a fellowship by the Regional Science Association International for her contribution to the regional science worldwide. Alessandra acted as co-editor of, or acts as co-editor of Journal of Regional Science, and previously she was an editor of the journal Papers in Regional Science. She has co-authored more than 100 academic publications in the most reputable journals of our disciplines, mainly on topics related to human capital and knowledge-based societies, also to regional and local labor markets for highly skilled workers, human capital and mobility, and also gender aspects in human capital migration, tourism and regional development, especially in peripheral regions. And most recently, she also contributed already quite a lot to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on different regions, on human capital migration. So we are very happy to have you here, Alessandra. And before you can start with your presentation, let me briefly also introduce our discussant, my colleague Jana Kleibert. Jana is leader of the junior research group Globalization and Knowledge Economy at the IRS since 2018. She joined us in 2015 already. And in 2019, she acted as an interim co-head of the research department, Dynamics of Economic Spaces. And Jana is a specialist of global production networks, particularly in service-oriented sectors. She has studied processes of value creation from a spatial perspective, and most recently, she started a huge research program on transnational education, which encompasses manifold new and old empirical phenomena. For instance, she studies international branch campuses, but also aspects of mobility of the highly skilled. Yes, but now, before we come to the discussant, we will have the keynote lecture. And please, Alessandra, we're really curious to hear your lecture.
So I did study German for 7 years. I did say this to Sarah before, but I will stop by just saying vielen Dank. And then I actually prefer to continue in English because I don't want to be too brave with my German. I don't understand. I don't remember anything anymore. Anyway, talking seriously, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy, very pleased to be here today to talk about a topic that is really dear to my heart, which is, while I'm talking, I'm actually trying to share my screen, which is actually related to human capital and mobility. Right, okay. Before I start, let me just clarify that if something is unclear throughout the presentation, you can actually ask me, interrupt me. I mean, just for clarity, I mean, I can take questions even during my presentation. Otherwise, of course, we will have a discussion right at the end. I will try to keep my talk within, say, 45 minutes maximum so that we can have a little bit more time for discussion at the end. As I said, today I'm going to talk about my main research topic, which is human capital migration. As Oliver rightly said, since I came back to Italy, I spent 18 years abroad, first in the UK for 11 years, and then the last 7 years before coming back to Italy, I was in the US, and then I decided to come back to Italy in 2017. So as you can tell, this human capital migration is very autobiographical, right? Because I did move a lot around the world myself as well. basically this research topic goes back to the years I was doing my PhD in the UK, so over 20 years ago. And I've always kept working on this topic because I really liked it back then, and I still like it. But at the same time, I actually combine my research on human capital with a lot of other aspects, innovation, more recently sustainability. And especially since I came back to Italy, I've tried to be of help to policymakers trying to get young people to not to leave or to even go back to the more peripheral areas in Italy, which are the ones struggling to retain this human capital. And, you know, this is really an issue for them. All right. Okay. So my talk is organized in 3 main periods: the past, the present, and the future. And since I've realized that I started working on this over 20 years ago, the past to me seems a little bit like this. You know, here you can see dinosaurs. I'm not that old, but sometimes I feel that old. And so I started working on the topic of human capital and migration exactly 21 years ago. And that was my phase when I realized that it was that long. And at the time when I started working with this data, micro data, individual data were becoming more available, but they were not still that available. So my, luck back then was that my supervisor, Professor Khan, had just, it was offered basically access to the student data in the UK. And so I had millions of observation on individual students, and then with a follow-up survey to over 50% of all the graduates in the UK. And basically it's not like he didn't know what to do with it, but of course he was very happy to have a PhD students working on this large amount of data back then at that time. And it was a large amount of data, something that nowadays with the computers we have, we wouldn't have any issue dealing with and do modeling. But back then, the funny thing was that I had to go for coffee while I was running my models and my calculation, because my computer back then was taking hours to actually run the calculation. And that was kind of good and bad, because I could go for coffee, you know, have a chat with my friends and say, oh, I'm working because I'm waiting for the results to pop up in my computer. Initially, what we were particularly interested in was the migration determinants. So we had this huge amount of data where we knew where the students were coming from, where they were studying, and we also knew where they were entering the labor market first and what kind of job they were getting after graduation. And we knew that 6 months after graduation, and then in a longitudinal survey, 3.5 years after graduation. And we wanted to understand a little bit better the pattern, right, of migration of these students. And so we wanted to know, what are the determinants? What are the push factor on one side? So why do they leave the places? And what were the pull factors? So what were the reasons why they were going into a different regions? And so we wanted to know, first of all, are there any individual characteristics such as gender or age or education that make this individual more mobile than others? And then, you know, assuming that we know that some individuals are more mobile than others, where do they go? So we were looking at regional characteristics. And in these regional characteristics, we were, of course, looking at labor market characteristics, because you kind of know that the younger you are, the more important the job is. But also looking at amenities. These are normally more important. I'm pretty sure you know what I mean by saying amenities. These are location-specific characteristics, such as the presence of a lake or a mountain, something that you can't move from a place and you have to go to a place to actually enjoy it. And we wanted to see if some of these were also related to young people mobility, even though in the literature, it's kind of established that amenities become more and more important the older you get. When you kind of have already some kind of savings, the job is important, but not maybe as important as when you have to enter the labor market and you start kind of enjoying other things in life. So On the determinants of the human capital migration, what we did, we first classified the students into 5 categories according to their kind of migration path. So we could identify two subsequent migration movements, one from where they were living before studying to where they were going to university. And then we could also identify the movement after they graduated. And so the first thing was to classify these young individuals with high human capital into 5 categories. The repeat migrant, which were the ones that were going away from the parental domicile from home to study. And then after studying, they were moving to another location, which was neither going back home nor staying at the university. Then this second category was particularly important. I'll tell you in a second why. We wanted also to identify the ones that were going away to study from a location, but then they were kind of going back home to work. So in a sense, you know, you form people, but then you manage to get them back to your original location. The third category is also very important, especially for universities, because these are the students that you want to retain. This is the famous student retention, right? They go away to study. So they come from Rome to study here in L'Aquila, where I'm currently working. And then we manage to keep them in the local area of L'Aquila. And this is very important because the reason why sometimes you put universities or branches of university in more peripheral location is exactly because you want to attract and retain young people. And then you had the late migrant categories. These were people that were studying home, they were not moving, but then maybe sometimes even encouraged by the success of their studies, were deciding to move away to work. In a sense, these are the ones that found their local environment a little bit too narrow after graduation, and they wanted to kind of, you know, spread their wings a little bit later. And then, of course, this was funny because I did call it the non-migrant category in my PhD and also in my subsequent work. But actually, initially, my supervisor suggested to call them the stickers, because these are the ones that stick to a place and never move. So they basically spent their whole life in the same location. Without actually showing you the work I've done over a period of years, on the who are the most mobile people and how they fill these 5 categories, what we found very interesting in our work was that the female graduates tended to be more dichotomous. So this is funny because when I was presenting this, there were all sorts of jokes about women being a little bit more extreme because they either were the most mobile, so they were repeat migrant, moving and moving again, or they were not migrating at all. While the male subpopulation was actually clustering in the 3 central categories. So the university stayer, the return migrants, and the late migrants. What we also found is that, and this is very much in line with the literature, it's that the younger they were, the more migratory they were, in the sense that they clustered in the repeat migration categories a little bit more, but also in the university stayer categories. Now, we didn't have data, quantitative data on the university stayers, but anecdotally, we attended some job fairs. And what we realized is that the local employers tended to select, let's say, more male and younger graduates, if everything else being equal. So there must have been a little bit of a selection issue there as well. What was also interesting was in the return migrants category, because what we found, and that was in line with some literature from the demography field, was that the lower achievers, so the ones that did graduate but with a very low grade, the one that just passed but didn't really have a very high grade, tended to be return migrants to go back home. And we did check whether they were going back exactly to the same postcode of their parents. Now, in the UK, there are over 2 million postcodes, and in each of postcode on average, you have 15 houses. So back then there were privacy issues, but not nearly as much as today. So I could get the whole postcode. And in fact, we found that they were exactly going back to where they were living before in the same exact postcode. So it seemed in our sample that these return migrants were actually more of a corrective movement due to some kind of failure or not so high success during their studies. And another thing that we found very strongly and that we actually pushed us to do some work later on the creative class and the arts students was that especially the graduates from these kind of more artistic subjects were clustering in these return migrants categories, so going back home. Anyway, here you have a reference if you are more interested in what we found in this. We also looked at the average direction, so to speak. We used some circular statistics, and we observe something that it's kind of well known, but we kind of produce some kind of evidence, strong evidence on that. And it was that there is, in the UK, there is a very dominant London pool. So if you look at these colors and the direction of the movement, you can tell that basically a lot of these students were actually on average migrating towards London. So London had this, and this is irrespective of the topic, not just art students or whatever, but in general, London is a huge attractor of these graduates. And we can actually say that in the UK, there is a primate city. So there is a city that it's different from everything else, and that was London. What was interesting in this contribution was the use of circular statistics that we did, because it's not much used, these circular statistics, but in the case of migration, it's very interesting because not only you can look at the average distance move or the factors that are pushing a movement, but you can also actually look at the confidence interval of the direction of this movement, in a sense, adding some kind of a second dimension to the movement. The second problem that, say, in the past was most common, aside from the determinants of migration, was actually the consequences of human capital migration. In fact, this is probably even more policy relevant in the sense that you can't really change the age of the gender of somebody. You can, of course, as a policymaker, try to push them to study more of a subject rather than the other. So there is something that you can do also on, so to speak, individual characteristics. But what policymakers are really interested is, okay, so what are the consequences of this human capital migration? Do people that migrate, for instance, earn more? Are they more satisfied? Are they happier? And what about regions? Do you actually find a connection between, say, this increment in human capital and, say, the innovation of a region? And so if you look at the different contribution back then, you can basically say that you can classify all the contribution into determinants or consequences, and the consequences are either individuals or regional. And so on the individual, we work a little bit on both issues. On the individual labor market outcomes, we actually found that in fact, migrating, the most migratory group, the repeat migrants, were actually benefiting also in terms of salaries from this migration movement. And in the case of the UK, we had 176,000 graduates. Over 70% of them were in the labor market. And we actually found that the biggest returns was for the ones that were actually happy to move and move again. Now, in this particular paper, we use a matching function. So we were actually looking at individuals that were similar in terms of individual characteristics. And we divided them into people that were migrating versus people that were not migrating. And then we were actually comparing these very similar individuals that were different mainly because they were migrating or not migrating. And what we found with different matching functions, so with different ways of creating these couples of similar individuals, that they were earning at least 10% more than the people that were not migrating. And with some of the other matching function, like the kernel one, this difference was even up to 15%. So it was not negligible, the return on migration. The ones, as I was saying before, as extra evidence of the fact that the return migration was not associated with something positive, we also found that compared to the people that never moved, so compared to the non-migrants, the return migrants were even losing salary. So they were worse off than not migrating at all. The ones that, and this, I always use this as an example to my students, saying, if you want to go away and study, at least do it good, do it better, try to excel, because if you actually end up at the bottom of the pile, you might be better off not moving at all and staying at home. In a sense, this was what the data were actually proving. Then, of course, as I told you before, we were also interested in looking at particularly types of graduates. Back then in the UK, there was a strong policy in favor of the creative graduates, arts types of courses with a lot of investment. But actually, in the labor market, then they were struggling quite a bit. And what we actually found was indeed that the salaries for these people were much lower, that they did tend to cluster a lot in the return migration categories, which in turn seemed to be linked to kind of, say, lower payoff. And so we did a lot of work on this topic. And we also looked at the more longitudinal data, 3.5 years. And in this particular paper that I'm mentioning, we were also looking not just at the salaries, but also at what it was the self-reported job satisfaction, 3.5 years post-graduation. Because one of the main criticisms of the first paper that we published on this topic was that the creative graduates have a different set of values, which is undoubtedly true. And hence, the fact that they were not getting a high salary was not an issue at all for them. Now, this was sort of true, but because the salaries were so much lower, I think it was an issue for them as well. So let me clarify a little bit better. If you get a kind of subsistence level salary, then maybe you don't care about having so much more. But what we found for this individual, and most of them were located in London, was that they didn't get enough to get by. So at the end, this might have been a problem for them as well, even with a different set of value. In any case, what we actually found was that this issue of the job satisfaction was not what was motivating the results, because the people that were unsatisfied with their job in the creative sector was much higher anyway. So we worked a little bit on these kind of issues as well. So as for the second dimension of the determinants, say the regional consequences, we did some more work on other topics as well, but one that I wanted to flag out here was the relationship that we found between innovation and the human capital flows of graduates in the UK. And what we found actually using a simultaneous equation model was that there was a kind of cumulative process at a regional level. So in a sense, innovation was increasing where you had more human capital intake, but also the fact that you had more human capital intake in turn was actually increasing innovation. So there was a virtuous cycle starting from this. And that was possible because we were using simultaneous equation modeling. we also found, and that was very interesting, that the effect of university on innovation was not so much related to R&D expenditure or spin-offs or whatever. There are some effects due to spin-offs and startups, but these are actually smaller in number. The main effect of a university on a region is actually that it's attractive it's a conduit of human capital. It's attracting the students, and then if they manage to retain the students, so if the retention rate is high, this is where innovation comes from. Not necessarily just self-employment, startups and stuff like that. There are, of course, these issues, but at least what our paper was showing is that they were not so large in terms of magnitude, while having this human capital working also in not self-employed jobs was actually quite important. All right, so past, we worked on determinants and consequences like everybody else was doing back then. What are we working right now with my group here at the GSSI in this topic that are very dear to my heart, and why? So I identified throughout the years, a couple of issues that were really bothering me. The first one was that if you look at the papers that measure innovation, if you look at the innovation economics, economics of innovation, whatever you want to call it, almost all of them use patent data. And, they all cite Grealick's and all these, they are aware of the limitation that these patent data have, but at the same time, although there are limitations, they keep on working with this patent data just by saying, well, everybody does that. We know there are limitations, but, they dismiss this limitation as if they are really minor. And I don't think they are. So, for me, it became clearer and clearer in time that patents are a very poor way to measure innovation, especially if, like I'm doing right now, you want to focus on more peripheral areas. So if, let's take an example in Italy, if you want to work on large cities, Milan, Rome, or whatever, it's not an issue really that you use patents as a measure for innovation. But if you want to work on more peripheral regions, patents are really performing very badly. And so you kind of lose any significance of innovation. And in fact, in 2017, together with two PhD students of mine, now they are both assistant professors, we actually did a review of the literature on interregional human capital migration. And we actually found that most highly skilled migrants end up working in advanced service sectors where patents heavily underestimate innovation. So there is this location issue with more peripheral regions, but there is also the fact that the service sectors are not captured very well by patents either. And so at least, let's say that if you want to keep on using the kind of more official data for which there are large data sets available, you at least have to include other intellectual property rights, such as trademarks and design rights. Now, the best would be actually to use the so-called community innovation services, which are very rich in information, except that the majority of these community innovation surveys are not stratified regionally. So if you want to do a work, say, at NUTS 2 level or whatever, NUTS 3, well, it's even more difficult, but you can't really take these community innovation surveys as being representative of that geography. So all sorts of problems there. But let's say that at least you extend to trademarks and design rights. So what we have been working with a couple of researchers that are working here with me at the GSSI, it's on looking at the these IPRs, patents, trademark and design rights in Italy. And we wanted, first of all, to see whether they had the same kind of geographical spread. And then also we were looking at the trend over time. And what you can see here in this graph is that between 2003 and 2012, trademarks and design became more and more important, but also they are more important in regions that traditionally were doing worse in terms of innovation, poorer regions. I don't know how well you know Italy, but in Italy we have a large north-south divide, right? With the south being poor and the north being richer and the center being somewhere in between. Now, if you look at the trademark and design, these were actually growing a lot, especially in the south of the country. So there's something to be said about these new types of innovation, maybe being able to help the regions that are kind of lagging behind a little bit. So that was interesting for us. Moreover, if you look at international and interregional migration subdivided by human capital, so high versus medium low skilled, you can see that the distribution in Italy is actually not identical. And in fact, what seems a little bit weird maybe to you is that the medium and low skills are more in the south, but also in the north east, while the high skilled are actually more scattered. There isn't a clear distinction there, but there are also some regions in the south that did manage to attract some high-skilled human capital. And these are international immigrants. If you look at the interregional immigration, so once they kind of settle down and then it becomes interregional, the picture looks a lot more similar, with the human capital basically flowing more towards the north. And in fact, the high skilled especially clusters in the area of Emilia-Romagna, which is this horizontal one where Bologna is, also the area of Milan, and then the area around Rome. And this is not surprising. So what we did was actually looking at the innovation at NUTS3 level and the relationship between this innovation and the share of immigrants by educational attainment. And what we actually found was that, first of all, the relationship was not the same between the different types of innovation, and was also different according to whether we were looking at international immigration or interregional immigration. So for instance, here you can say that the high-skilled international migration was very important, extremely important for trademarks and design rights. Of course, here I'm just presenting a table, but behind this table, there is a long set of regressions with different, in which we control for a lot of different variables and factors. But these were our variables of interest, and I'm just trying to summarize the results here. So what we found was that this international high-skilled immigration was very important, especially for trademarks and design rights, so more on the services kind of stuff, a little bit less on patents per se. Medium-low migration, oops, sorry, I don't know what happened. Medium low skill migration was, of course, having a negative relationship to innovation because they normally settle in more traditional sectors, less innovative. Interregional migration, high skilled, was actually more important for trademarks as well, but more for patents and design right. So it looks like these high skilled workers are going more maybe in non-service sectors and more linked to traditional innovation as measured by patents, while the medium-low interregional migration was negative for all kinds of innovation. Okay, and so this was just to give you an idea that we are trying to expand the way we measure innovation. Right now, we are actually working with primary data, and we are looking specifically at more peripheral areas, but we still don't have the final results to show. The second issue that we wanted to look at was the relationship between human capital migration and sustainability. So I know you will not believe me, but actually we started working on this topic before the COVID and before actually sustainability and the green economy became a big deal. And so in a sense, probably we were lucky because we were already working on these and now everybody's talking about sustainability and green activities. But given this growing interest on sustainability and green activities, we were interested to check whether there was a relationship between these migration of human capital and sustainable economic activity. And I'm working with, again, two researchers here at the GSSI, Adriana Pinati, who's from Venezuela, and Martina Dalmolin. And what Adriana did, actually, she looked at a report by the European Commission 2020, in which they created a EU taxonomy of environmentally sustainable economic activities. Then she actually codified all the activities we are still working at the case of Italy. And she mapped them, dividing them into, well, overall, say, activities, and then she divided them into manufacturing and services. And well, we were going through a crisis between 2009 and 2018. So most of these areas were actually losing employment. And so it's not so surprising that employment was actually declining in most of this region. And it was declining also on what the European Commission was calling the sustainable activities. However, what was really different was the map, the two maps, one of manufacturing and the other one on services, were really, really different, and were telling us something maybe interesting again on the service sectors, because there were a lot of provinces that when you were looking at sustainable services were actually doing not that bad in the post-crisis or crisis period, in the crisis period, 2009, 2018, in these 10 years. Not just in the north, but also in the center and also in the south. And again, this goes back to the fact that we did find an increase in design right and trademarks in the south of Italy when we were looking at innovation in the previous paper. And so then here, I mean, without you looking at the numbers that are even a little bit smaller, but just to flag out what were our main results so far. We're still working on these. We still have to kind of, refine the results. But so far, what we found was that a 1% increase in the share of high-skilled migrants is associated with a 6.2 increase in the employment growth of sustainable activities. So they are helping these sustainable activities, while a 1% increase in the share of low-skilled migrants is associated with a 3.9 decrease. So in a certain sense, these human capital, high-skilled individuals are placing themselves in these kind of more sustainable activities, which are also normally the more innovative and new. However, there is a significant, the signs and significance stay the same even when we divide between manufacturing and services. And also, this is in the paper if you are interested, when we control for endogeneity using, instrumental variables and to refine our analysis. But this is interesting. So we just started working on this, but it's interesting to actually link the human capital migration with the sustainability, long-term issue. Okay, let me just breathe 1 second. Okay, it's 20 to 3. I think I'm doing okay with time. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, that is, okay, 10 more minutes, fine. I think I will do fine. So, and now what about the future? Okay, so it's always difficult to think about the future, but I can kind of sketch here what we are working or what we are planning on working in the next few years. The first big question is the big data one. I'm sure you've all heard about the big data, say, revolution, challenge, or whatever. And here we also started working at big data coming, for instance, from social media. So here I give you an example of the paper that Oliver mentioned before. We are now doing some work on COVID. Actually, this one is also published. I was going to tell you that the other one was published and this one was under review, but actually it's already published because it's been accepted, and you find it in Structural and Change and Economic Dynamics. And so in this particular paper, we were using data coming from Facebook. So there's 4 of us, because actually looking at this big data from Facebook took a lot of time, and there were a lot of issues, because we believe in general as a group that there is a lot of potential in big data, but that they are also very dangerous, because you might run the risk of getting lost in big data and you don't know exactly what to do with big data. If you don't have some kind of theory behind, I wanna call it in a more simple way, if you don't have any kind of intuition of the word, something that you think it's like that and you want to prove, right? But if you have an idea and intuition, it's very easy to get lost in all these data. Because what the Facebook data were giving us were the location of people 3 times a day. So these were very high frequency data, and we had millions and millions of observations, so a very large sample. Something that with my computer back then when I was doing my PhD, I couldn't have handled at all. It would have taken me probably a few weeks to just run a model. Now we can do that because we have the computer power to do that, but that doesn't mean that it's easy conceptually. And so now there are plenty of sources of big data. Facebook is one. In another paper on a completely different topic, we actually analyze tweets from Twitter. And I can tell you that it's fascinating to work with these very large samples and with this very high frequency data. You can do a lot of stuff, but at the same time, they don't come without issues. As I said before, it's very important not to do data-driven research when you use such an amount of data. You need appropriate tools of analysis and even appropriate hardware and software, because you can't just run the first model that comes to mind. And the third issue is, of course, that you have issues of privacy and anonymity. So with these very large, big data sets, you can do a lot of stuff, but you can't do the thing that I was doing with my much more limited database back then, because you don't have any kind of individual characteristics. And even if they have these individual characteristics, are very difficult to get, because we could not get the education level of the commuters, for instance, which would have been very interesting. The second direction that we are moving here at the GSSI is instead of using just secondary data, we also collect primary data with surveys, but we would like to go one step forward. And here it looks very, dramatic and very technological, but we have been working with some behavioral economists and also psychologists in a group in a university based in the center of Italy. And we actually believe that there is some leverage here to actually work, not just with geographers, we always work with geographers and regional economists, but working with psychologists and behavioral economists as well. And this was an idea that we had even before the COVID, but it became even stronger during the COVID period, because the COVID changed the preferences and decision-making process of people. So for instance, we did observe a change in the type of houses that people are looking at, or, we just completed a survey. We're working on smart working and the location preferences of people. And there are more people that want to move a little bit outside large cities after COVID, for obvious reasons, less density, more quality of life. Their psychology, in a sense, changed. And so we are now in the process of getting some of these experimental tools like mouse trackers or eye tracking, and to use them to study the differences in the decision-making process between, say, I don't know, migrants or non-migrants, but even between genders, because I've always been very interested in seeing if there is a gender dimension to the decision-making process. This is something that I've always been kind of interested in, the personality traits of people, the personality traits of migrants. And with a PhD student of mine that I had in the US, and now he's working for the US government, we did have this data that were also collecting the 5 big personality traits of migrants. And these were extraversion, agreeableness, consciousness, emotional stability, openness to new experiences. That these were all self-reported, of course, because this was a survey. And we did find that migrants exhibit greater extraversion and openness to new experiences on average, which is consistent with what you would think, but also they were less agreeable, conscientious, and emotionally stable. So, I moved around so much, unfortunately, because I might be emotionally unstable or more unstable than other people. But these were self-reported personality traits, and in a sense, the more sophisticated behavioral tools might allow us to test whether, also with more objective kind of tools, you can kind of see that there is a difference between them. And it is policy relevant because different findings, say, on different risk aversion of migrants could be linked also to a different attitude towards entrepreneurship and or innovation. So in conclusion, and I think I'm pretty good on time, I think the future looks bright if you want to study migration, if you want to study human capital issues. It's not like this is a topic that will kind of exhaust itself. Also because there are so many new sources of data or methods or tools that you can actually use. And so we can deepen our understanding of human behavior, and in turn, this will improve the understanding of many economic phenomena, of which economic migration, human capital migration is one of them. And personally, I want to actually conclude by saying that, 21 years I studied the phenomena of migration, and I have more questions in my mind right now than I had when I started 20 years ago. So the more I study this phenomenon, the more I realize how humans are absolutely complicated. So now it's a kind of a joke, but I work here with a lot of physicists, and I always oversimplify things. When I talk about human beings, I always have to remind them that they're not atoms. They're not all the same. They don't have the same kind of properties of the thing that they study. And this is what makes my work so interesting, but also so challenging. Humans are complicated. And so the more I study this thing, the more curious I become on certain traits, characteristics, phenomena that I don't understand. And so, just to say at the end that knowledge has a beginning, but has no end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. Great